All right, so let's talk about what has happened in chapters 7 and 8 of Treasure Island. So we read in I Go to Bristol, chapter 7, about how Jim stays at the hall full of sea dreams as he and the doctor wait for the squire to send for them. He spends his time brooding and thinking over the map, and in his imagination, so his dreams, he climbs all over the island, exploring what it says every acre of its surface. So Jim is preparing for his adventures, and he makes his adventures on the island more believable. But the reality, we're told, that will exceed his imaginary adventures is full of strangeness and actual tragedy. Because you have to remember that this book is being told from Jim's perspective, for the most part, Jim's perspective, as he's recalling memories of this adventure. So we are told at the very beginning of the book that this book is Jim's remembrance of this journey. So this is him remembering. And so there are times when he will kind of allude to what will happen as he tells it, right? So it's saying that the adventure was actually strange and tragic. Okay. A letter then arrives from the squire describing the schooner, so the ship, the Hispaniola, and he describes Long John Silver, the cook, and he pities the one-legged sailor whom he is believing that has lost his leg due to his patriotic duty, right? His fighting for his country. But the author notes that the squire trusts Silver because he has a bank account. Remember, he says that his bank account has never been withdrawn or overdrawn, meaning he's never taken more than he has. And in this sense, money, again, is kind of giving off this feeling of respectability, that you can respect someone who has money. But Jim and us as readers are kind of cued or told a bit of the danger of this one-legged man when Silver's wife is a woman of color. We learn that she's only the second woman that we've heard about, even talked about in this book. And the squire suggests that Silver is anxious to go back to sea, more to escape his wife than to improve his health. And we're also alerted to the fact that Silver, if you caught on to this, Long John Silver seems to have taken over as far as the hiring of who he wants on the ship. It even says that he fires two of the squire's choices, right? He fires them. So he's already gained a power that as a cook he shouldn't have had if he was only being hired as a cook. But you kind of have to catch on to these very subtle things that the book is trying to tell us of what might come. So we read about Jim is leaving his mother, and what he says is in good health and spirits, that she's given this cozy new armchair. And in that simple phrase, the cozy new armchair, we're kind of catching hold of this kind of comfort of home, but we're being contrasted. So given the opposite idea of this hardship of adventure. And we even read that Jim is kind of jealous of this apprentice that has been hired to help his mother. And we read that he cries for the very first time, and he cries for the only time about leaving home. His tears are soon forgotten because he's so enthralled and infatuated with this idea of going to sea, of this adventure. And he even describes the smell of the salt, the figureheads, the terry pigtails, the gold earrings, the old sailors that are a delightful dream. And he even contrasts this idea to even if he had seen kings, he would not have been as excited or as captivated as he was by looking at these seamen, right? And he even describes the squire as kind of turning to the romance of it all. He dresses like a sea officer and even imitates a sailor's clumsy walk. So we're getting kind of this idea of how Jim feels of this adventure. And then in chapter 8, this is at the sign of the spyglass. The name Spyglass should have connected Long John Silver to Treasure Island in the reader's mind. So in your mind, right? But Jim doesn't necessarily catch on to this right away. The inn, like Silver himself, is more than meets the eye. It's described as a bright little place with newly painted signs and red curtains and cleanly sanded floors. But despite its appearance that it's clean and respectable, Jim is almost afraid to enter because of how noisy the customers are inside, because they talk so loudly. And Long John Silver is described to us as kind of being likable and trustworthy. Just as in Jim's dreams that he had, he's missing this leg, but it doesn't compare or even impair his strength or his mobility. So even though he's missing a leg, he's able to get around on his crutch like a bird, meaning swiftly, right, and easily. He whistles cheerfully, and he even gives his favored guest a slap on the shoulder, meaning he's very friendly with his people. Now, despite the coincidence of his tavern's name, Jim thinks that there's no possible way that this clean and pleasant landlord could possibly be this one-legged man of his nightmares, right? But suddenly, Long John Silver announces loudly who Jim is. And this man with missing 2 fingers gets up and runs out. And Jim automatically identifies him as Black Dog. And yet Jim doesn't kind of put 2 and 2 together of who Long John Silver might possibly be. He vaguely remembers seeing him as the blind man being there. And Jim is completely temporarily taken in by Silver's pretense when he says he could have convinced a judge. So we're kind of seeing both sides to this. Jim thinking back in the memories of this happening and him trying to describe what it felt like in that moment. So Long John Silver is so convincing he could have convinced a judge. For the rest of the chapter and for the rest of this book, Jim's suspicions of Silver will kind of ebb and flow, meaning we will see him in a positive and a negative light. We will see him as being trustworthy and him being not trustworthy. We will see him as a friend and a mentor and as an enemy throughout this book. So this idea of Long John Silver as being good or evil will constantly be at conflict without the book, or throughout the book, should I say. So Jim's doubts about Silver, together with his descriptions of his attractions, will be confusing to us throughout the book, because we will constantly pull with whether he is good or whether he is bad. And this letter says, I don't put much faith in your discoveries as a rule, but Long John Silver suits me. So we're kind of getting this idea of good and evil here. And it's kind of a precursor for what we will read in the next chapter and the chapters to come. So I hope that kind of gives you like a sneak peek at what this book is going to be like, of who Long John Silver is, of how this contrasts with Jim and who he is. And then you'll see kind of how this adventure unfolds.